So the paper that I proposed for the conference, as these things often turn out to be, didn't get completely finished. There's still a fifth part to it to be written. There's a lot of footnotes to be added, and the paper's grown far too long to adequately read within the time allotted and still have time for questions. So I'm actually going to only read from the first three parts. The fourth part actually deals with Aquinas' appropriation of Anselm, so we can talk about that if we want to in the Q&A. But I'm particularly interested in sort of inserting Anselm into McIntyre's account. So, in After Virtues, aptly titled Chapter 13, Medieval Aspects and Occasions, Alasdair MacIntyre passes over one medieval thinker, a philosopher and theologian of arguably the first rank, namely Anselm of Canterbury. He does discuss the scholastic doctrine, usually in passing in a few earlier and several later works, but there is relatively little engagement of this innovative Benedictine thinker. Even in his recent God Philosophy Universities, Anselm's contributions to the Catholic philosophical tradition are relegated to a chapter lumping him in with Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius. Although MacIntyre includes him in several laudatory listings as a member of an ongoing intellectual tradition, the analysis that he provides of Anselmian themes is entirely confined to faith-seeking understanding and the so-called ontological argument, easily lending the impression that Anselm made little or no additional contributions to the Catholic philosophical tradition, in particular to moral inquiry. In actuality, Anselm's role, scope, and influence has been considerably greater, not least in the domain of moral inquiry, theory, and practice. Now, my goal here is not to criticize MacIntyre, but rather to supplement his account. Now, I'm not saying that, After Virtue should have been like 3,000 pages long. Everybody who, should have been inserted in there gets their place. It's, he's telling a particular story with certain key points. What I want to do is supplement his account by inserting a fuller account of Anselm's thought, practice, and influence into MacIntyre's account of medieval moral theory and inquiry. So bring Anselm into conversation with, and to some degree illuminated by, MacIntyre's concepts and concerns. I'd like to make it clear from the start that my argument here, to use some common medieval categories, is not one grounded on necessitas, but rather convenientia, often translated as befittingness, but here perhaps understood better as greater adequacy and intelligibility. Put in other terms, I'm not claiming that MacIntyre need have engaged Anselm in order to make his own master arguments, but rather it would have been better, more befitting, resulting in a richer, more robust narrative of medieval thought had he done so. So the paper, as it's intended, had 5 sections, 4 of which are written. In the first, I review MacIntyre's explicit reference to and discussions of Anselm as a medieval Christian thinker. In the second, I discuss how Anselm fits into the Augustinian tradition of moral inquiry as MacIntyre articulates it. In the third, I turn to Anselm himself, setting out 7 key features of his moral theory. I'm only going to cover 6 here, actually, though. Leading up to discussing his views on virtue and vice. In the fourth part, I discuss Aquinas' engagements of Anselm, and in the fifth, I discuss his wider influence in medieval thought. So the first part, if we view MacIntyre's works from After Virtue on as representing an ongoing contributions to an overarching project, something that I take as uncontroversial here, and if we focus specifically on his discussions of Anselm, a progressive deepening of appreciation becomes apparent. Anselm goes unmentioned in After Virtue, but gets a brief mention in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, where he says, the late 11th and 12th century European culture was one in which philosophical inquiry was largely unsystematic and theological studies largely unphilosophical. There were, of course, exceptional philosophical figures such as Anselm and Abelard. There he's saying something that Hegel is saying as well. MacIntyre, however, concludes there, the intellectual climate in generations following is better represented by John of Salisbury. Anselm receives somewhat more substantive discussion in 3 rival versions. The first occurs in the context of the problem of different and rival Augustinian epistemologies. MacIntyre writes, it is then in the inescapably universal application of the concept of perfection that God is universally acknowledged, an acknowledgement which Anselm transformed into an argument. An argument that from the assertion of the existence within the mind of that than which no greater can be conceived, it follows then that then which no greater can be conceived also exists outside the mind. Anselm's arguments, McIntyre continues, are in no way accidentally in the form of prayer. To understand the required concept adequately, the mind must already be directed by faith towards its true perfection. The rational justification of belief in the object of faith is internal for the life of faith. So that's the big reference. Later, when articulating the relationship between inquiry and accountability and arguing that truth must be more than warranted assertability, McIntyre notes, to be accountable in and for inquiry is to be open to having to give an account of what one has either said or done, and then to having to amplify, explain, defend, and if necessary, either modify or abandon that account. And in this latter case, to begin the work of supplying a new one. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle invented and perfected a dialectical mode of accountability. The Bible and Augustinianism a confessional mode. Anselm moved from confession to dialectic. Aquinas both from confession to dialectic and from dialectic to confession. McIntyre makes one other, less specific reference to Anselm in that work as well when discussing what he takes to be a 14th and 15th century genesis of the institution of academic philosophy. He tells us, "It is always salutary to remember that most of the history of philosophy has occurred outside of the history of that particular professionalized institution." And he talks about Augustine, Anselm, Abelard, and Aquinas, lumping all the A's in pretty much, define their activities in terms of a very different conception of inquiry, which they could have called philosophy, and some of them in fact did. Anselm is also referenced in two essays on the tasks of philosophy. The more substantive one occurs in First Principles, Final Ends, Contemporary Issues, focusing on Aquinas' conception of truth, in which Aquinas cites Anselm and Augustine, among others, and he says, "The complexity of Aquinas' view is a consequence of his having integrated into a single account theses from both Aristotle, an Islamic and Jewish commentary upon Aristotle, and from Augustine and Anselm." Perhaps the most sustained engagement of Anselm on McIntyre's part occurs in the recent God Philosophy Universities, a selective history of the Catholic philosophical tradition, where he devotes roughly 4 pages rather than mere paragraphs to Anselm, unfortunately sticking to the most part to discussing Anselm's so-called ontological argument. And I'll only cite the one passage from that text which gets beyond that particular concern. McIntyre says, "Using the word philosopher as we use it now, we may say of Anselm that he was a philosopher malgré lui, and despite himself, as well as a dialectician and theologian he took himself to be. What is true of Anselm is true also of all those who had done their philosophical work in the Augustinian tradition, and indeed all of their patristic predecessors. In one important way, they were therefore not contributing to the Catholic philosophical tradition. That is, to a tradition within which a Catholic allegiance is inseparable from a recognition of philosophical inquiry as a secular and autonomous activity and tradition. Yet in another way, they made a major contribution to that tradition. For when it finally emerged from the 13th century, those who founded it drew heavily on the Augustinian and patristic philosophical resources provided by the theology into which they were educated." A few remarks on McIntyre's account of Anselm are in order. First, within this narrative, Anselm resides entirely within the confines of the Augustinian tradition as McIntyre has construed it. Second, the main interest Anselm presents is as a main representative of that tradition and as a source Thomas Aquinas engaged as an interlocutor, assimilating important contributions from Anselm's thought, abandoning the inadequate or irrelevant detritus of the remainder of his works. Third, the ontological argument accepted. These contributions are confined to almost entirely epistemological concerns, the connections between faith, reason, and practice on the one hand, and the nature of truth on the other. McIntyre's account strikes one as an assessment one might reasonably make of Anselm's thought if a person were to focus principally on the proslogion and on a certain set of Thomas Aquinas' references to Anselm. In certain respects, it appears eminently modern, redolent to the very problematic McIntyre himself critiques, a retention of philosophical vocabulary, narratives, and figures, coupled with a self-unaware lack of understanding of these, rooted in a disconnect from the matrices of practice, theory, and tradition. At the very least, this account can be faulted for not doing justice to the Anselm we know, not only through his own text, but through the effects his thought exerted on medieval thought and practice. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and ask, How does Anselm fit within the Augustinian tradition as MacIntyre depicts it in works like After Virtue, Whose Justice, and Three Rival Versions? I'm skipping over the discussion of Anselm as a paradoxical figure in his own right. Just to focus on the Augustinian aspect that MacIntyre is working out. So, in some respects, Anselm perhaps appears to diverge from central problematics or disputes distinctive to that tradition. Although he's interested in texts and teaching, he rarely cites other authorities belonging to his own tradition, and even in treatises which pertain to the study of sacred scripture in his own words, his emphasis is placed almost entirely on employing resources to better understand subjects not only raised by scriptural passages, but also problematic or puzzling in moral life. He also seems rather uninterested in the master metaphor of the world as text. Anselm is, to be sure, a Christian Platonist indebted to Augustine, but draws very infrequently upon imagery of illumination as compared, for example, to the Augustinian focus on developing memory or mindfulness, understanding, and love, this three-part thing. He arguably sidesteps what MacIntyre calls the apparent contradiction at the heart of the Augustinian account of knowledge. It's not to say that he resolves it. He doesn't deal with it at all. So maybe he's not an Augustinian then. In many other respects, Anselm is a figure right at the center of this Augustinian tradition of moral inquiry. His works are indeed intended as vehicles for argumentation, intelligible to non-Christians. For example, in the case of Cur Deus Homo, where Anselm both credits holy fathers and teachers for presenting the rationality of our faith, for refuting the foolishness and breaking the obtuseness of infidels, and for nourishing those who with hearts already cleansed by faith delight in the rationality of that faith, and then explicitly adopts it as his project. At the same time, some practical commitment to Christian faith and life, some degree of intellectual and also volitional development, at the very least some openness, will be required in order for that rationality to be progressively more adequately grasped by the reader. Skipping down a little bit, Anselm's texts make demands and claims upon their readers involving the kind of trust MacIntyre identifies particularly with Augustinian tradition. This offers the opportunity for Anselm's works to become, to some extent, as MacIntyre calls them, texts in which such a person discovers the story of him or herself, including the story of how he or she was transformed into a reader of these texts. That's how he describes the scriptural texts and also texts within the Augustinian tradition. Such a personal narrative is then revealed as located within yet more encompassing narratives which impose their own demands on both the person's intellect and their will as the condition for uncovering fuller intelligibility. And MacIntyre continues by saying, that history is a movement towards the truth becoming manifest, a movement towards intelligibility. But in the course of discovering the intelligibility of the order of things, we also discover why at different stages greater or lesser degrees of intelligibility remain. So that's, pretty typical. I think everybody here is familiar with MacIntyre's, reading of the Augustinian tradition in that part. Another key aspect is the will. MacIntyre, following a number of other scholars, credits Augustine with the discovery of the will as such as a faculty capable not only of determination of other faculties or parts of a human being, but is radically self-determinative. Setting aside controversies, whether Augustine really discovered or invented the will as a faculty, it would be more accurate to say that Augustine provided a definitive and fruitful articulation of the concept of will, one more adequately corresponding to the reality we encounter within and without ourselves. If we look at MacIntyre's characterizations of Augustine's insights, Anselm is again recognizably Augustinian. MacIntyre says the difference between Augustine and his classical as opposed to his New Testament predecessors can be described in two closely related ways. The first concerns how the failure of how someone who knows what it is best for him or her to do, but nonetheless does not act accordingly, is to be explained. Augustine holds that it is possible for someone to know what it is best to do in a particular situation, and for there to be no defect in the passions as such, except that they're misdirected by the will. The will, being anterior to reason, has at its most fundamental level no reason for its biddings. For Augustine, intellect itself is the second way. Intellect itself needs to be moved to activity by the will. The human will is then the ultimate determinant of human action, and the human will is systematically misdirected and misdirected in such a way that it is not within its power to redirect itself. Two important corollaries of this perspective also get discussed by McIntyre. And the first has to do with affectivity, desire, and love. He says, our desires need to be directed towards objects other than those to which we first find them directed and ordered hierarchically. The direction and ordering of human desires is the work of the will. And because human desires are in whatever state they are in because of either the direction of or the failure to direct the will, human desires, unlike the desires of other animals, are voluntary. The second has to do with justice, the virtues, and in particular with the virtue of humility. McIntyre writes, the fundamental human virtue is a virtue of the will in its returning to freedom, just as the fundamental human vice is the vice of the will in its self-enslaved condition. The fundamental human vice is, of course, pride. Correspondingly, the fundamental human virtue is humility. Justice, therefore, cannot inform an individual's character unless that character is also informed by humility. And the rootedness of justice and pride entails, the rootedness of injustice, in pride, entails that injustice consists in disobedience. So all of this is fairly standard reading of the Augustinian tradition, which Aquinas is supposed to have synthesized and assimilated. McIntyre expands what he calls the Augustinian tradition to encompass two other fateful developments within medieval thought and practice. And he'd have to do this if he wants to say that everything is Augustinian, because obviously not everybody was, a follower of Augustine in that sense. So these two fateful developments are the ongoing project of monastic and in particular Benedictine life, and the complex interactions between church and state in medieval politics and culture. Anselm was both formed and formative in both of these developments. McIntyre notes, it was because intellectual inquiry in the Augustinian mode is conceived as a progress towards perfection through an ever more adequate apprehension of perfection that theoretical inquiry and practical inquiry were so closely interrelated. He goes on to point out that the disciplines of monastic life, more especially those of reformations of monastic life in which the rule of St. Benedict had been reestablished, provided a religious ideal, one which provided a practical analog and quite arguably fertile soil for Augustinian moral inquiry. So McIntyre actually says the rule of St. Benedict's practical theology presupposes what St. Augustine had affirmed, that it is only through the transformation of the will from a state of pride to one of humility that the intelligence can be rightly directed. Will is more fundamental than intelligence, and thinking undirected by will, uninformed by humility, will always be apt to go astray. As a spiritual director, and as abbot, prior, and finally archbishop, Anselm also finds himself drawn both willingly and unwillingly directly into the wake of the second development McIntyre describes, in which McIntyre's words, the realization of the institutional and other practical implications of the Augustinian standpoint was achieved often enough by those who were not themselves theorists, except in an ad hoc manner, in the course of debates and struggles over practical issues, but whose words and actions emerged from a background and beliefs structured by Augustine's theology. Gregory VII, Gregory the Great, was the figure who McIntyre singles out, discussing how he, quote, articulated his political theology in the course of discharging four distinct but related papal responsibilities. And Anselm was actually deeply involved in three of these as sort of an inheritor of this problematic. He didn't deal with Gregory. He dealt with later popes in his role as Archbishop of Canterbury. So, the three that he dealt with were internal reform of the church. If you read his letters, constant problems. All sorts of problems going on. As a matter of fact, anybody who's tempted to critique the church, in whatever sense, at any given time, really ought to read, some of the letters these spiritual directors and bishops wrote back, centuries before, and just find out just how bad things were then, Internal reform of the church, affirming the order of justitia, justice against ostensibly Christian rulers. Anselm had to be exiled from England twice for opposing the Norman king of England. One of the people trying to direct one of the nascent nation states. And then finally, formation of the principles of justice. So McIntyre is giving us a picture, just to sum up a little bit here, he's giving us a picture of the Augustinian heritage that's very robust, attentive to the interrelation between theory, practice, and some of those practices include things like prayer, engaging in memorizing the Psalter, all sorts of things along those lines. And Anselm, although MacIntyre doesn't tell you this, Anselm fits right smack dab into the middle of all of that. If all it takes is, reading through, say, the life of St. Anselm, or reading through some of his works and letters, and you see how he fits into this matrix. In the third section, which I'm going to hit on now, I'm looking at how Anselm himself reworks Augustinian monastic moral theory. So I'm not going to try to provide a comprehensive or even adequately detailed exposition of his moral theory. This requires an effort of integrating numerous discussions from his corpus as a whole, a task I'm undertaking in the monograph I'm writing on the subject at present. Instead, I'm going to discuss, originally 7, now just 6, key connected themes worked out in Anselm's moral theory. Prior to that, though, I would like to point out one central and often overlooked feature of Anselm's thought, which integrates his moral theory into his broader project of faith-seeking understanding. And it's good to begin from the formula Anselm develops and uses in the work that MacIntyre does reference, the proslogium, which we're all familiar with because we've all had to teach the Ontological Argument at one time, and hopefully use primary texts. The proslogium starts from this, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Right? Quo maius cogitare non possum. Now, several things need to be noted. First, Anselm uses this formula to develop a single argument, as he calls it, an Unomar Argumentum, running through nearly the entirety of the proslogium. An argument intended not only to prove that God truly exists, but equally, and these are Anselm's words, that God is the supreme good, needing no other good, and that all others need so that they might be and be well, and, quote, whatever else we believe about the divine substance. So moral theory adequately worked out will be inextricably connected with the metaphysics and epistemology orienting the human created being to God for Anselm. Second, Anselm not only explicitly uses this language of that than which nothing greater can be thought in other works, which are much more closely focused on moral philosophy, like the De Veritate or the Curtius Homo. He consistently employs and uncovers the logic implicitly involved in this conception, which calls the human being both to use and to improve all of its resources of reason and will, in order to more and more adequately understand not only God, but the nature and condition of human being, the contours and interrelations of truth and justice, and the complex and fateful interactions between divine grace and human free will. All of that is there in this formula. And so, seeing it as post-Kant, the ontological argument, or a tiny piece of the ontological argument, really obscures the picture. So, the first thing, modalities of truth. Study of Anselm's moral theory really must begin with his treatise De Veritate, or On Truth. There, beginning from analysis of the most easily understood experience of truth and signification, he goes on to analyze truth in thinking, including reasoning, and truth in sense perception and judgment. If he stopped with these, his theory of truth would not be particularly interesting, but he also examines truth in several other modalities. These include truth in the will, truth in action, truth in the being of things, and the supreme truth, that is God, in which all other truth participates. As John Whipple points out in a passage judiciously cited by Christopher Lutz, inclusion of certain of these dimensions places Anselm in a, quote, general tradition regarding the nature of truth, one including not only Augustine, but also later Avicenna, one heavily Neoplatonic, as he calls it, emphasizing the truth of being. This tradition is then at odds with a, quote, more Aristotelian conception that stresses truth as an adequation of mind and reality, or truth of the intellect. Anselm, however, makes several additional moves, not least of which is insisting that there is truth and falsity in the will and in action, not in a merely analogous sense, but actually, originally. He is able to do this precisely because he comes to understand truth as rectitudo, rightness, what is the case when something is as it ought to be, or does what it ought to, or when something does what it was made in order to do. So within a teleological scheme, right? But he views teleology as built into the fabric of created reality. Second, Anselm distinguishes between two types of truth. One which something possesses when it conforms to this norm, which can be or not be, and a deeper sort of truth, inalienable from what bears or is conditioned by that truth. Third, Anselm notes the interconnections between these different modalities of truth. even signification and thinking are actually within the realm of action and can be judged accordingly. An action in its turn, at least for rational beings, depends on the will. Actions and volitions, even the very being of a thing in turn, are also significative and can be judged according to the truth of what it is they seem to claim, state, betray, or presuppose. So that's one important aspect of his moral theory. The second one is justice as rectitude of will. As Anselm understands it, justice is at its very heart a configuration of truth. On truth, he introduces the formula that will run throughout his works. Justice is rightness of will, but it is not simply any rightness of will, any case of the will conforming to what is right, willing what one ought to. He introduces a further qualification which both injects a kind of self-referentiality and stresses motive and mindset. Justice is rightness of will kept for its own sake. As Anselm notes, a volition does not merely have an object of what, but also a subjective motive of why. There can be truth in the will when a person wills what they ought to, but this is not yet distinctively human moral goodness, that is, justice, unless they will what they ought to for the right reason, at the very least implicitly, because it is the right thing to will, and because thereby they maintain that very justice within the will as a valued good. What he's doing there is it's not to say that this is completely radically new, that a lot of this can't be found in Augustine, but he's taking Augustinian doctrine and really crystallizing it, laying out the contours in ways that are quite precise. Four other things need to be noted about Anselm's conception of justice. First, it admits of degrees. It's possible for a person to be more or less just, and it's possible for one's determinate willing to be more or less just. It's not just an off-on switch. Second, injustice is fundamentally the privation of justice, which ought to be present in the person's will. Moral evil and injustice is not something determinate on its own, but rather something parasitical upon being, goodness, and justice. Third, although it's not possible for a human being to be entirely unjust, and even given that there are degrees of justice and injustice, there is a threshold above which a person is just and possesses justice, below which a person is unjust and is deprived of justice. Fourth, while justice and injustice can rightly be said and judged of all sorts of things, including actions, persons, states of affairs, relationships, or policies, in every case for Anselm, he's very, very clear about this, says this many times. In every case, those justices or injustices derive ultimately from a just or unjust will. So justice is completely connected with the will. So let's look at the third thing now, which is his analysis of the will. One key need for moral theory Anselm discerned was providing an account of the very structure of the will. As just noted in On Truth about determinate acts of volition, he used the familiar distinction between subjective motive and the object of the will, and discussed how an action or volition could be both right and wrong at the same time, depending on which perspective you're looking at. I don't have it in here, but he also focused a great amount on the need to develop what we would call, in contemporary terms, adequate descriptions in moral language of what's actually going on. What Thomas Aquinas calls the moral species of an act, right? In On Freedom of Choice, Anselm explains how a person can be willing and unwilling in the same situation. He also distinguishes between freedom of the will in its first sense as the ability to keep justice for its own sake when one possesses it, and a more common but defective understanding of freedom, the freedom to do what one wills, whether it be good or bad. Most importantly, he begins to elaborate a tripartite distinction about the will itself, between the will as instrument, the faculty of will, the will as use, and the will as inclination. By means of this distinction, he is able to lend additional intelligibility to phenomena like weakness of will and temptation, discordance within the will, resolution and perseverance, responsibilities people bear for inclinations and habits, the connection between free will and rationality, and even interactions between divine grace and human choice. In On the Fall of the Devil, he further develops his account of will by explicitly distinguishing between two fundamental inclinations of the will. One of these inclinations is the will to happiness, which every sentient being possesses. This basic structure of the will directs us towards the goods we judge to be beneficial, or commoda is the Latin term to us, and away from evils which we judge to be harmful, providing us with a structure of motivation and desire that not only inclines the will and involves the intellect and will in determinate situations, but also comes to take on lasting, habitual, developed patterns and orientations. The other fundamental inclination is the will to justice. This differs from the will to happiness in several important ways. Unlike the will to happiness, the will to justice, which is in fact the state of justice within the will, can be lost. This occurs when a person willingly abandons their will to justice by preferring something else to the justice, which that person ought to instead keep. Another important difference is that whereas the will to happiness is not itself happiness, its own object, but rather desires, pursues, and chooses what conduces to happiness, the will to justice actually is that very justice. To will justice is to choose to keep it, to resist temptations, to abandon it, to value it above all other lesser goods. It requires that the person will justice, act out of justice, love and desire justice, and cultivate that state of justice within him or herself. I should also put in there, they need to also understand what justice consists in. Another important difference is that the will to justice is supposed to moderate and regulate, to introduce greater rationality to the will to happiness, which in a fallen creature is liable to lead one into injustice. Lastly, once lost, this is for Anselm, the will to justice, although the person can regret its loss and can desire it, cannot be restored solely by the will of that person. It requires cooperation between the willing person and divine grace, which is the section that I pass over next, so that will remain, murky and mysterious as grace often is, right? Let's move on now to pride, self-will, and humility. This is another central conception, not only in the Augustinian tradition, but particularly for Anselm. The most difficult, fundamental, and enduring obstacle for human beings in accepting, preserving, and willing in accordance with justice, in Anselm's view, is the vice of pride, a radically disordered moral and intellectual condition which generates an obscuring or inversion of right apprehension of moral values in the human person. The term that Anselm actually uses more often than superbia, which is, the typical word for pride, which gets to the very heart of what he understands it to be, is propria voluntas, which can be translated as one's own will or as autonomous willing. None of these are particularly great translations to get across what he's getting. And in the paper I talk about how he doesn't come up with this term, but he's again, transforming it. It's used by Benedict of Nursia, by the anonymous master who wrote the rule before Benedict, Augustine, Jerome, John Cassian. But Anselm is doing something a little bit more developed with it. Anselm provides additional precision required for its centrality in his moral theory. Pride's promise is that the creature can determine its own will entirely or even just essentially on its own basis, setting itself above the normativity built into the very fabric of created being. To follow pride, even in the name of some conception of justice, inevitably entails abandoning justice within the will. And paradoxically, it does not bring freedom to the would-be autonomous being, but rather subjugation to something else, a lowering not only of the being and its dignity, but even in the manifold of its desires. In terms of the two fundamental inclinations of the will, pride inevitably requires abandoning justice, becoming thereby subjected not only to outside forces, but also to one's own appetites and the disordered will to happiness. While obedience is strictly speaking the opposite of pride is self-will, what most counters the vice of pride is the virtue of humility. Anselm both practices and preaches the conceptions of this virtue, set out by other earlier members of this tradition, and makes new contributions of his own, treating the virtue most explicitly in the De Similitudinibus, most of which is Anselmian. There's a bit of detritus in that text, which is why it doesn't get included in the Anselmian corpus, that other people snuck in. One of the side effects of becoming somebody famous in the Middle Ages is other people would write stuff and stick it under your name. So the De Similitudinibus acquired non-Anselmian parts, but the parts on humility are definitely, at least the textual interpreters think, Anselmian. Anselm devotes considerable discussion to humility in that work, about which a few remarks are going to have to suffice here. First, using the similitude of a mountain, Anselm sets out 7 progressive degrees of humility, an account supplementary to St. Benedict's own 12-rung ladder of humility, which Thomas Aquinas realizes when he considers that very question in the Secunda Secunda, discussing humility. Are Anselm and Benedict's accounts actually compatible? Second, humility does not consist in abasing or devaluing oneself, but in attempting to understand and enact one's own proper value in relation to other beings and God. Third, it is humility, according to Anselm, that not only reflects but actually provides a person with adequate self-understanding, cognitio sui. Fourth, humility is required as a basis for the other virtues. This does not mean, of course, that before other virtues can be developed or vices rooted out, one must previously have ascended all the levels of humility, but rather that the person have and concretely choose the right volitional vector and orientation in order for those virtues to be more and more adequately understood and cultivated. What time do we go to?
We go to a quarter after, right?
Oh, three.
Three. All right. I am going to skip the section on concord or harmony and just jump to the part on the virtues and vices then. According to Adler, one of his close friends and biographers, Anselm uncovered the origins and, so to speak, the very seeds and roots and processes of growth of all virtues and vices, and made it clearer than daylight how the former could be attained and the latter avoided or subdued. Unfortunately for us, Anselm never authored a treatise on the virtues as such, and it appears that his teaching on the virtues and vices was largely carried out in oral form. What we do possess are a number of scattered discussions and references which can nevertheless be drawn together, allowing us to systematically reconstruct at least outlines of Anselm's teaching. He holds that the virtues are, in their full senses, good mores, qualities of the soul which were unstable, now brought to the condition of habit. They exist in the soul as stable. Correspondingly, vices in the full sense likewise have rooted themselves within the soul and particularly within the will of the person who is suffering from them. Anselm also speaks of the virtues and vices in a more encompassing manner in which they signify wider identifiable patterns of behavior, desire, willing, noting, for example, that within Christendom, as he says, certain people are strong in the virtues, but many are weak. He tells us, it is not so often as one does the work of virtue or vice that a person is properly said to have virtue or vice itself, for it's insofar as one has them then when they are possessed from habituation that human beings are said to be just or vicious. So he's got a fairly well-developed conception of virtue. It's not, departing radically from other people talking about it. Anselm regards virtues and vices in the wider sense as opposite ends of a threshold, and then in the stricter sense as consolidations further opposed to each other and more distant from that threshold. The human will, in the sense of will as use, determinate acts of will, will in determinate occasions, is poised upon and can cross that threshold between these. In fact, Anselm frames the human will, at least in many circumstances, as continuously poised between willing justice or willing injustice. When the person's will is properly aligned by right use of its own capacity for self-determination, he tells us, the soul is open to the inclination of the virtues and to willing what should be preferred, memory to remembering what ought to be remembered. He goes on all these ought tos. He says, the mind is raised up to charity, is disposed to humility, is strengthened towards patience, and is open to the other virtues that should be generated. Choosing wrongly, willingly succumbing to temptation, sets one instead on the path of the vices and produces a will deprived of justice, turned against itself, subject to the effects of its own privation. Anselm starkly draws the lines between these two alternatives and lays out the resources for the will's right guidance. He says, God suggests, reason suggests, virtue suggests that I live rightly, and that within me is the material within which I can do that if I will. Opposing this are the devil, the carnal appetites, and the vices, to which one might also add things that Anselm talks about, bad reasonings, actions, and the examples of other persons. Giving into these deforms the will, darkens the intellect, eventually admiring the vicious person within a condition from which they cannot extricate themselves without aid. Anselm depicts the virtues not only as habitual states of willing, desiring, and acting in a person's soul, inclinations towards what is right, that actively provide guidance to the person. In fact, they are essential to the functioning of reason itself in practical context. He says, just as the human body cannot subsist without frequent provision of food to it, so the soul cannot live by reason without frequent engagement with the virtues. They require acknowledgement of and steer us towards deeper collaboration of our free will with divine grace for Anselm. And Anselm criticizes certain prideful people, as he calls them, who judge that the entire efficacy of the virtues resides in the free choice of the will alone. In fact, as Anselm counsels in numerous letters and his treatises, we're called upon to continually improve what measure of the virtues we possess at any time. And I'm going to skip over some of these many references where he's telling people that they ought to do that. He also says that we have to develop a capacity for perseverance within the will, for resisting the temptation to choose goods incompatible with justice, a kind of fortitude, and he uses that term, consisting in willing perseveringly. Indeed, and here's where I'm going to finish, indeed fortitude or courage, as Anselm understands it, ranks among the architectonic virtues, those most integral to practical life and moral inquiry. Noting this provides a good occasion to bring these outlines to his moral theory, his outlines of his moral theory to a close by making a comparison between Anselm and McIntyre. In After Virtue, McIntyre signals a similar status to three virtues. He says that we need justice, courage, and honesty. These are, in a certain sense, architectonic. And he goes on in further works to identify other dispensable virtues as well. Anselm's moral theory incorporates all of these and articulates the core virtues as justice, courage, humility, charity, and concord. The other thing that I'll say very quickly is in the section on Thomas, start off by talking about the ontological argument. People generally tend to think that Thomas just rejects it entirely. Commentary on the Psalms shows that that's not the case. He actually says Anselm was right. But there's a whole complicated picture there. And then I go in and look at the Thomistic conception of truth. Thomas very clearly took Anselm as one of his main interlocutors in working out this conception of truth that McIntyre then will see as very important. McIntyre wants to, see something like Anselm was talking about, truth in action, truth in the will, and all that. So Anselm could, in fact, be a resource for that. Thanks. We're actually at time, but I'll take whatever questions people want, and people can go if they want, or, yeah.
So, a couple things that you said, Anselm confirms. So, like, humility is not as debasement of oneself, but as the right understanding of oneself in relationship to the whole.
Well, and to other beings.
Sure, yeah. Exactly, yeah. And to oneself, men and women. And then the will to happiness contrasted with the will to justice.
Yeah. And
plus the will to justice being its own object and something that we have to have some kind of divine aid to have. So these...
Once we've got it, we don't need divine aid to keep it. When we've lost it, we need divine aid to restore it, for Anselm.
Okay, sure. When I hear these things, I hear the voice of Kant.
Yes.
So, I mean, these are things...
And you should also hear Scotus, too.
That may be. I'm less familiar. By total chance, I read Kant on respect, humility, dignity, and the moral law for a conference I'm going to next.
Yeah.
And he says these things. I mean, is there a connection there?
No. There's not a connection between... There's not a connection in the sense that, like, Kant read Anselm and, pirated these thoughts in or something like that. There is a connection in the sense that there are structural similarities there. It's very interesting. If you look at Anselm's moral theory as a whole, there's a question, well, what kind of moral theory is it? Clearly, if we use our categories that we like to use, like utilitarianism, no, it's definitely not that. Could it be a deontological theory? And some people have wanted to see it that way. It's not like Kant's, because Kant focuses on the purely formal. And also, Kant doesn't have God in the picture, necessity of interacting with God and grace and all that sort of stuff. Anselm's theory does end up being a virtue ethics, but it's got some very clearly strong deontological parts to it, which should show us that there is something to deontology.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking of a level deeper than Norbert Deontology is sort of constructed as meta-ethics, right? So if you look at Kant as talking primarily about the structure and pure reason, right? It seems that's exactly what Anselm was going to if he believes, I don't even know what this...
Well, he doesn't do any sort of analysis or critique of pure practical reason by itself. That would be very foreign.
Isn't that what it would mean for justice to be its own object?
That you have to carry out a critique of...
No, I mean, that's like a different way of saying the categorical imperative.
Yeah, although the will to justice and the will to happiness are not... When the will to justice is actually functioning the way it ought to, it's going to integrate the will to happiness within it. All the... when a well-functioning human being, as opposed to a screwed-up person like me or maybe some of the other people in the room, it will actually curb and gradually modify the will to happiness, our basic affective structures, so that we want the right things. We take pleasure in the right
Sure.
things. Because this question comes up, especially not so much in relation to Kant, but in relation to Aquinas. Aquinas is, saying, well, if you get your basic desires right, and you actually understand what happiness is, it's kind of easy street from there, and you're not going to need something like a will to justice along with that. You're going to will justly because you recognize what the good for you is and all that. Anselm is saying there's something else. It's not just that we recognize this ultimately desirable object out there, and that's sufficiently motivating. We need something within us, which actually is going to turn to come from that ontologically, and makes us more whole in the process. So, roundabout way of answering that question, I think. Yeah.
When I think of Anselm in the context of virtue, I think of the fact that he defines free will as an ability, like you mentioned, which to me looks like
freedom of the will as an ability. Free will is the
free will. This is an ability to preserve uprightness for its own sake, right? That's
freedom of the will. Yeah.
Right. So I see him as sort of the beginning of the tradition that Servetus Pinchers put so much effort into, with the difference between freedom for excellence as opposed to freedom of indifference. Because with Anselm, I understand you don't have, in as much as you are choosing to do the wrong thing, limiting and losing freedom. To the degree that you do the right thing, freedom is maintained and expanded. Yeah, I mean, it's not like Anselm is coming up with this all by himself, totally out of pure thought. I'm not claiming that, but it's in De Libertate Arbitri and De Causa Diaboli, it's bigger in there than I've seen it anywhere previous.
Well, Augustine, I think Augustine, he gives Anselm a run for his money on this, right? At least in that. And, I would say, too, some of the monastic fathers. This is something I think is deficient in McIntyre's account. You read somebody like John Cassian, who is not really giving his own take on stuff, but presenting what he's learning from not Western fathers, but Egyptian and Syrian monastic fathers. They knew what the will was. They had some, really serious. I mean, these guys thought about this stuff. They had some serious insights into the relationship between, grace, freedom of the will, how we could lose that, whether it was, just freedom to do whatever you want, or freedom to be directed towards this other thing. And Anselm is getting those guys, in part because they read them at the monastery. Benedict's rule actually recommends reading these monastic fathers. So Anselm just doesn't cite anybody. It's a problem. Yeah.
I just have a small technical point, but at some point when you were talking about the vices and virtues, you talked about thresholds.
Yeah.
I think a better term might be continuum.
Well, there's a continuum, and then there's a threshold at the end of that continuum, and then once you cross that threshold, you're in the other continuum. Anselm does think that there's certain points at which you pass from justice to injustice. It's not like there's a, gray zone in between where, it could be either way or something like that. And it's that way with the virtues and vices. I should add, too, that he doesn't have an Aristotelian conception of the virtues as being like in between two vices. It's a much more Augustinian thing where, you got your one vice, your one virtue, and sooner or later everything's somewhere in that spectrum. There's, at the one end of the continuum, you've got like really solidly developed justice, really solidly developed injustice. That's what we usually call virtues and vices, right? But the medievals quite often would talk about lesser and lesser amounts of it, so that you're doing unjust things, and you've crossed finally into the threshold of being unjust, or you're acting without fortitude. Sooner or later, you're not able to stand up to things. You get angry. There's a certain point at which you cross, and you're no longer a patient person. You're an angry
right,
person.
but I guess I was sort of weighing that maybe more in the Aristotelian sense too, because in Aristotle, vices and virtues are also individual to the person in their capacities. I mean,
Yeah.
what's virtuous for one person may not be virtuous for a different person if you're in a different...
To a certain degree.
Well,
I mean, there's some things that are always going to be like, you know, off limits.
Right, but I mean, even, you know, if you think about the exercise of courage in a situation where if you're at a dock watching it, I use this in class a lot, if you're at a dock watching a drowning kid,
Yeah.
and, you know, person A is a trained lifeguard, person B doesn't know how to swim, to jump in and try and save the child, for person A, that's kind of the virtuous, bordering courageous, but maybe not because they're a good swimmer.
Yeah.
For person B, for them to jump in,
It's
that's vicious. I mean, that's not courageous, it's foolhardy,
Yeah.
and they have to go get somebody else who do something. So you have two people in identical circumstances, but the virtuous action is different action.
That's true.
By virtue of their individual capacities.
Yeah, there'll be something like that for I mean, there's something like that for Augustine, something like that for Anselm, too. Yeah.
Just a small follow-up on the idea of continuum and threshold and whatnot.
Yeah.
Maybe some virtues have a gray area. Maybe.
For Anselm, you're saying?
I'm saying as a substantive.
In general.
Yeah, as a substantive claim, you've got, say, truthfulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got someone who just tells wild lies, right? And someone who just doesn't say the true thing when they ought to have.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like they're lying. It's not like they're not. You know, what do you say of that exactly? It's sort of not a gray area maybe, but it's a funky area.
Well,
where they're not vicious, but they're not virtuous.
It's a great time to make distinctions.
Yeah.
You know, they're not virtuous or vicious in the full strict sense, I would say, but they could. For Anselm, they would be. You know, see, when we think in Aristotelian sense, Aristotle says that some people are virtuous and some people are vicious, and one of the good things about virtue ethics is you don't have to be virtuous or vicious in order to be evaluated as doing good or bad actions, because you can say, well, that's an unjust action because that's the kind of thing unjust people do. You know,
like that action was vicious.
Yeah,
but you're not vicious necessarily.
You're not yet.
Yeah.
You know, but you better watch it.
Have you seen anything like continence and incontinence as stages between vicious and virtuous in Anselm?
For Anselm, he doesn't talk in those terms. Could we analogize between those? Yeah, I think we could, because for Anselm, when we do injustice, we're not just doing something that's wrong and against some sort of standard. We're doing something that fundamentally disorders our soul and makes it tougher the next time around for us to do the right thing, and sometimes even recognize it as the right thing. So it can produce that lack of self-control that acrasia is. And that ties in with the conception of freedom to be able to actually do what we ought to be doing, to align ourselves with what we know is right. Yeah, in a certain sense, the acratic is less free, right, than the self-controlled person. Not as free as the virtuous person. But
is there going to be a chapter in what you're writing also about the relationship between, say, the work of the Holy Spirit in one's life and virtue and vices? When you read the other theological works like Credeus Homo, Virtue, Conception, Original Sin, stuff like that, that's all there.
Yeah.
But I don't want to say it's bracketed out of on freedom of choice, or it's not as prevalent.
Well, it's just he hasn't come in yet. As big. He does talk about the need to have grace in order to restore justice that's lacking in the will, and he also tells us, God Himself can't take away justice in the will once you've got it. Only you can throw it away. Anselm says in the De Concordia that the ways of grace are so many and so manifold that I'm not going to try to explain all of them. And he never does some sort of systematic analysis of that. But yeah, it'll fit in there because Anselm also sees two other things to say about that. So Anselm thinks that we have been given as part of our human nature a lot of the stuff that we need in order to behave properly and to get ourselves moving on the right track. Those also do involve cooperation with grace. Oftentimes we don't see that as cooperation with grace. The other thing that he says that's really important is that we receive grace not just directly from God, but through the mediation of other people. And you can look at the same thing in two different ways. So let's say you help me out, right? You're there providentially to give me the advice that I need at the right time that would actually like help me be restored to justice, so I'm not going to be so much of a schmuck, right? And now, you're doing that out of your own free will because you're cooperating with the grace that God has given you. And let's say you're a totally just guy, you know, and by hypothesis, right? And
really well.
so you're doing it because you're actually making a choice on your part to use the good that you have and to retain it, to maintain the will to justice. Part of that is helping me out, right? So from one perspective, it's wholly you. From the other perspective, well, where did you get all that stuff from? From God. So God's grace is coming to me for me to cooperate with via you. Then does that take away your freedom in any degree? No. What we're called to for Anselm is this community in which our will and the divine will and everybody else's wills harmonize with each other, and we're able to share in this complete communion. You know, very different from where we are. Very different from where Anselm was most of the time. But he sketches that in the Proslogia towards the end. Yeah.
Kingdom of Anselm.
Yeah, kind of. Only less abstract.
Yeah,
You know?
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to live in Kant's kingdom of ends.
No, I'm just making it.
Calvin, you wanted to talk about stuff? You have questions, or can I draw this to a close and you can ask me afterwards?
Be interested to know which came first, biographically yourself. You're interested in French debates or in the medieval philosophy that guided a lot of their subject matter.
In the case of Anselm, I've been interested in Anselm for about 15 years. So that antedates the Christian philosophy debate stuff.